This whiskey was released to mark the longest and brightest day of the year. Let's hope it lives up to that reputation by being a bright, flavorful whiskey with a very long finish. This week, let me tell you about the new release from Dingle Grianstad on Tsamhraidh. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, I'm the Whiskey Nerd, and like I said, this week I'm looking at the latest release from Dingle, the Grianstad on Tsamhraidh. This is a lovely little whiskey, so let me get it into the glass and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. Now, what is Grianstad on Tsamhraidh? Now, first off, what is Dingle and what is this series they're doing? Well, this is Dingle. This is like one of the biggest kind of like craft distilleries in Ireland. It was one of the newest kind of batch of whiskey distilleries that opened up in the last few years, but it was like the first and one of the biggest of those kind of craft nudist style distilleries that opened up in Ireland. So it's only about 10, 11 years old right now, and they're getting to the point where they're getting to have like age statement whiskey releases, but they don't have enough stock on hand. So they're doing this series right here. It's a 2-year series, and every time there's like a Celtic festival that happens, they're kind of releasing a whiskey to mark that festival. So they're kind of giving themselves 2 years of a buffer time to build up that stock to have like an age statement whiskey. And the festival they're marking this time is Grianstad on Tsamhraidh, or the kind of summer solstice, the longest day of the year. In fact, the Grianstad on Tsamhraidh literally means the stopping of the sun in summer. So Grianstad, sun stop on Tsamhraidh, the summer. So it's like the opposite to the winter solstice, where the sun is getting higher in the sky. It stops once it hits like the specific date, like the 21st of June, and then it starts going back down. So this is like the longest, brightest day of the year. This is the 7th release in the series, and there are 9 releases total, with the last release going to be, I believe, the December 26th this year, which is the Láil an Droghlian, the Wren's Day, which is a festival down in Dingle. But we're not here to talk about those releases, we're here to talk about this one right here. This is a single pot still Irish whiskey. If you're not familiar, pot still is the style of whiskey that's unique to Ireland. You can only make it in Ireland, and the rules for it are kind of simple, but they allow a lot of flexibility. So essentially it has to be at least 30% malted barley, at least 30% malted barley, and at most 5% other grains. So distilleries can kind of play around with it. They can go 50-50 down the middle, they can kind of play around and go like 70-30, 30-70, or what Dingle have done, gone 60-40, with the 60% being malted barley and the 40% being unmalted barley, which should give it a bit more sweetness than like some pot stills. So pot still whiskey, it's kind of like oily and rich and spicy, but that malted barley gives you this kind of sweet kind of caramel notes to it to complement the kind of spicier notes you get from the raw or unmalted barley. Interestingly, this whiskey was aged primarily in bourbon casks and then finished in rye casks, and the rye casks coming from the Sagamore Distillery over in America. And they don't have an age statement on the bottle, so they don't have an age statement on any of these whiskies in this series, but they've kind of be quite public about it, that it's about 5 years in the bourbon cask and then about 2.5 years in like the finishing cask. So all these whiskies are all around 7.5, 8 years old. So they're all around that area. So they spent about 5 years in bourbon before being finished for 2.5 years in that Sagamore rye cask. That is actually the same style that they did for a previous release, the Láil an Droghlian, St. Bridget's Day. I reviewed that. I'll put a link to that up there if I remember to put a link up there. And that whiskey was a single malt that was aged in bourbon and finished in those Sagamore rye casks. So it's basically the same whiskey, the same style, the same kind of treatment, but with a different base spirit. And I'm just thinking about it now, I might actually do a comparison to look at like how different the spirit is from that same distillery. The same raw ingredient, like it's all barley, but one is pure malted barley and one is 60% malted and 40% unmalted. So let me know if you want to see that video there. And just a few last little facts on this. It is natural colour, non-chill filtered, like all Dingle whiskies are, and it comes in at 52.5% ABV, or alcohol by volume. That's what, like 105 proof, so it's not super high, it's not like really high cask strength, but it does have a lot more flavour than those kind of 40s, 45% you do see with other whiskey distilleries that are releasing whiskies these days. It's a pretty limited release. Now, they didn't say how many bottles are in this, but for their single malts, there's generally about 10,000 bottles in the releases in this series. But with the single pot stills, it's actually only about 5,000 in the previous releases. So I'm guessing this release is only going to be about 5,000 bottles because Dingle make more single malt than single pot still. So this is probably going to be a fairly limited release, not super small, like 5,000 is still a fairly large number of bottles, but if you've been able to get the releases in the past from your shops, from your bottle shops, chances are you'll be able to get this. There just might not be as many on the shelf as some of those other bigger single malt releases. But I think that's enough talking about the whiskey. I think it's time we go in for the nose. Let's go in. Oh, that is very immediately like Dingle up front, but almost a little like sweeter, a little bit more, a little lighter. So Dingle single malt, if you ever tasted it, has this kind of like fruity herbal character, and that is in here, but it's like a little bit lighter, a little bit brighter, because that kind of like spicy notes you get from that unmalted barley in there gives you that little bit of like, I don't know, just extra bright flavors coming through. Like there's, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of sweetness in here too. Like there's caramel, butterscotch, and toffee, like those deep kind of brown sugar flavors, but there's also a lot of citrusy notes coming through here. Like it's, I wouldn't say it's exactly like a lime zest, but it's in that area where it's kind of like natural. There's also, like they say on their tasting notes, like lemon sherbet, and I can kind of get that idea, like a citrusy, almost sour, almost sharp, but still quite sweet, and I can get that. But to me, it's a little bit more like a lime. A little bit, you can see that kind of sharp citrus like that lemon, but for me, it's a little bit more like a lime with a bit of like ginger spice coming through here, because it is kind of herbal. It is kind of like botanical on the nose, like the rye cask influence. It's not super strong. It's not super dominating, because rye gives you this kind of like, I don't know, like eucalyptus, herbal, black tea. Those kind of flavors come through on rye. But for me, here it's just adding to that kind of core herbal sweetness that you get from that Dingle note. So it's not really apparent. It's there, it's kind of adding to it, but it's not like a distinct note unto its own. There is a bit of that like peppery pot still spice. Like normally with pot still spice you get this either white pepper or cracked black pepper note coming through, and for me on the nose it's definitely leaning towards like the white pepper, you know, like the ground up fine white pepper powder you can get. It's like that. It's not super spicy, but it is a little spicy. It's like that, again, that herbal natural spice coming through, and the more I'm sitting with it, the more I'm like going back to it and nosing it. I'm actually getting like almost a bit of like toasted coconut, like that kind of natural sweetness, not super sweet, but like that little bit of toasted coconut is coming through a little bit. Yeah, on the nose, the more I sit with it, I'm getting that kind of flavor coming through. So it's not one note on the nose, but it is nice and kind of refreshing. It is quite light, it's quite bright, it's not heavy on the alcohol, it's not super strong on the nose. It's kind of like, even though it is at 52.5%, it's not super strong. It's kind of like light. Every way the flavors are, they're there and they're strong, but they're like light. They're almost like bright, if that makes sense. They're not like deep or low. We have to search for them. They're just kind of coming out of the glass nicely. So I think that's enough talking about the nose. Let's go in for the palate on the Dingle Grianstad on Tsamhraidh. Cheers. Okay, that hits the palate in a big way. You get this kind of hit of like oily spiciness up front. Like oily is maybe the wrong way. It's like it's thick. It's kind of like thick like honey. Like it spreads across your palate really richly, but then it's got this spicy, peppery, pot still kind of spice that immediately follows it up. There's also a little bit like on the tongue, the tip of the tongue. There's that little bit of like citrus, kind of like that zing, that kind of like sour note coming through, but not sour in a bad way, but like that bright citrus kind of flavor coming through on the palate. When I swallowed it, I immediately got a lot more oak coming through as well. So I will go in for a second sip, but on an initial approach, like you get that like heavy duty spice. It's not super high on the ABV again. Like it feels warm, it doesn't feel like it's burning. When it hit my palate, it was a lot of flavor as opposed to like a lot of alcohol hitting my palate. So I'm gonna go in for a second sip, chew it a bit and see what else I can find. Cheers. Yeah, it's definitely a sweet whiskey on the palate. Like, you still get some of those like almost caramel brown sugar notes from the nose, but they're actually almost a bit more like icing sugar. Here is where I'd say it's like that sherbet. It's like that bright white powdered sugar with a bit of citrus. Again, quite sweet there, but I like that kind of cracked black pepper coming through. And also reminding me a little bit like almost like licorice, like on the back end. Maybe that's more into the finish now, but like getting that herbal anise note, like the anise seed, like black licorice. Again, that'll be the herbal kind of Dingle character with that kind of rye cask influence, just taking those herbal notes and amping them up a little bit, making them up a little bit stronger. The pot still spice, definitely there, definitely warming, definitely like tingly on the tongue, definitely going a little more peppery, a little bit more spicy on the palate than it was in the nose. The nose kind of like white pepper, the palate a bit more like black pepper, like earthy, sharp, kind of biting black pepper. You get that nice hit of spice coming through on the palate. So I think it's time I go in for the finish on this whiskey and see how long it sticks around, and if it lives up to the name of Grianstad an Saoire, the longest day of the year. Hopefully the finish is just as long. Okay, so up front you get that sweetness, but then that actually does fade pretty quickly. You get that citrusy note, you get that kind of like lemon zing coming through. Then you get the oaky spice coming through, and that's kind of fading off too a little bit. But what I'm left with is that like oak spice and the peppery spice, like that kind of bite, the pot still pepper spice is lingering on, getting this kind of like nice little tingle on my tongue. Like I said, that's 3 sips of it there. Like, it was never hot, it was never high on the alcohol, just nicely kind of strong, flavored coming through, not overpowering, just there and nice. It has a good long finish as I'm talking. I'm still tasting it. I'm getting that little bit of licorice note coming through again as I'm breathing, but still with that kind of peppery spice coming through. So it does have, I think, a nice long finish that does, I think, kind of live up to the name of the longest day of the year. It should have a nice long finish on it. So it's a nice lingering one, but never like overpowering, never something that says, oh, I've got to let that one sit. You know, you can go back and go back and go back on this whiskey. Before I give my final thoughts on it, if you're new here, scroll down, hit that thumbs up button, hit that subscribe button. I put out whiskey reviews every Wednesday, and I put out cocktail recipes featuring whiskey every Friday, and I will have a cocktail recipe featuring this whiskey this Friday. So if you want to see that, make sure you hit subscribe. And while you're hitting subscribe, while you're hitting that thumbs up button, leave me a comment down below and let me know if you've ever tasted any of these Dingle whiskies, or if you've tasted kind of the Dingle Wheel of the year and what your favorite release from them has been. But now for my like final thoughts on this, I like this whiskey. I think it's a good little whiskey. I think it's not my, it's hard for me when I'm reviewing these whiskies because I've reviewed the other 6 releases now. I kind of compare it against the others. I don't think it's my favorite whiskey in the series so far. It's a nice one. It's kind of sweet with that, you know, the double kind of rye, you know, the bourbon and the rye cask. Get a lot of sweetness, but it doesn't overpower with the sweetness. You get that pot still spice, you get that kind of like eucalyptus kind of flavor coming through almost from the rye cask influence. But I think the other ones have been a little bit more exciting for me, where I get that big second cask influence coming through and you get a lot of flavor from that. It's a nice whiskey, don't get me wrong. If you're collecting the set, I think you will enjoy this one. I don't think it's a whiskey to be missed, but if you're just picking up whiskies that you like here and there, and you see the whole range in front of you, there are other ones like the Samhain release, like the Lunasa release, that if you like kind of like the sweeter kind of whiskies, or you like whiskies that have like a lot of flavor coming through from their cask and their finishing cask, you might want to pick up those ones first. But this one, it's not a bad whiskey. But that's just my thoughts on it. Like I said, if you've tried any of these whiskies, let me know down below what your favorite is. Like I said, it's not a bad whiskey, and I'm definitely going to enjoy this, and I'm definitely going to enjoy making a cocktail with it in a little while. So if you want to see that, make sure you check back. But right now, I'm going to enjoy this whiskey, and I will see you next time. Sláinte.